Hi students, Miss Wiley back again. We're going to finish up our video lecture over migration. We just have a little bit more to talk about. In terms of migration flows, we'd already talked about global and regional, so now we're going to talk about national migration flow. It's also internal migration, so you're only moving within the same country. Again, this is more common because it does happen as a rule of Ravenstein, where most migrations are a short distance. You have more commonality, opportunities. It's just easier for people. So the Great Migration is probably the one we talk about the most, and this was when African Americans moved from the South to the North during World War I. They'd been persecuted in the South. With the Jim Crow laws. You have the boll weevil that destroys crops, and so their livelihood is compromised. And there are more job opportunities in the North because a lot of soldiers had gone off to fight in the war. This also creates a opportunity for intervening. So as they were driving, or not, excuse me, not driving, but taking the trains up to the north, they'd stop at a station and people would say, hey, we've got jobs here, and they would stay there. So instead of going all the way to Pittsburgh or Chicago, they'd stop in St. Louis or they'd stop in Indianapolis. That's an intervening opportunity. The other thing I want to talk about with national migration flow is that this also relates to another law of Ravenstein, in that after the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, African Americans moved back to the South because, again, Jim Crow laws were outlawed. They felt like they had more opportunities down there, so they would move back to the South. So that's, again, a counter migration or return migration. You also have examples of Russification. This has happened in Russia, national migration flow. It happened periodically within the Soviet regime, trying to push people out of Moscow, trying to get them more into the Siberia, colder area. There was also a return migration after the Soviet era ended, with people moving back to Moscow. And then there's a national migration flow in Mexico from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. In the north, you have maquiladoras. You have these U.S. factories that are on the border in Mexico, and it's got better job opportunities. Still not paid as much as you would get in the United States, but as more people from northern Mexico move into the United States, which again is regional migration flow, then you have people from southern Mexico to northern Mexico to work to take those jobs in the maquiladoras. All of those are national migration flow. Guest workers would be an example of more regional migration flow. You oftentimes have them come from other countries. They fill a void in the job market. So if there's, again, maybe soldiers are off at war and you need people to work in the factories, for example, you may invite people from other places in your country or from another country to come in. Usually this happens for a short period of time, hence why it's called guest worker, and they're assuming that they will go home once the labor need subsides, once the war is over and the soldiers come back. Often the guest workers do send home remittances to their home country, so the home country benefits from this as well. Refugees is a little different. Refugees is where people are fleeing. They are not migrating. They take very little things on them. Usually it's whatever they can fit in a bag. They are either walking, running, taking a bike, maybe a boat. You're not getting on a plane. You're not getting in your car often. You're fleeing because your life is in danger, but you want to go back home. That's the main difference between a refugee and a migrant. Refugees want to go back home. So these are some areas of heavy amounts of refugees. We talk more specifically about this in terms of regions of dislocation. So for sub-Saharan Africa, it's important that you remember Rwanda. We talked a little bit about this with the Hutus persecuting the Tutsis. We also talked about Sudan with the Janjaweed persecuting the Black Christians in the southern part. That has since been resolved in the sense that there's two countries now, not quite as much tension. In North Africa and Southwest Asia, we talked about of course, the problem in Syria, probably the worst refugee crisis in the world. We also talked about the Kurds in Iraq being pushed out by Saddam Hussein, and we talked about the Palestinians fleeing Israel, trying to get support to fight the Israelis to get their land back. Let me just say right now, I have this wrong on the slide and I want to correct it. So North Africa and Southwest Asia is the region with the most dislocation. And then you have Sub-Saharan Africa. So let me see if I can correct this right now and then make it. There we go. So now we're back into having the corrected list. So North Africa and Southwest Asia have the most refugees. Then you have Sub-Saharan Africa. It used to be Sub-Saharan Africa at first. And because of Syria, that's no longer the biggest number of refugees. Third on the list is South Asia. We talked about, of course, Hindus and Muslims moving with the partition of India. That's regional migration flow. That's culture and traditions for a push factor. But Sri Lanka also has conflict between ethnic groups. Sinhalese and Tamils are fighting over the island of Sri Lanka. And so that has caused people to flee as a result of the conflict. In Southeast Asia, please remember Myanmar and the Rohingya Muslims that we've talked about, and we talked about with our Socratic seminar. You also might want to consider remembering Indochina, which would be like Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. So just recall those as well, excuse me. And then in Europe, remember former Yugoslavia, that was a conflict, a cultural push factor, because the Bosnian Muslims in Kosovo and Albanians were persecuted by the Serbian presidents, I should say. And so Yugoslavia dissolved in the 1990s, mid-1990s. Remember, you have your regions of dislocation chart. Please look over that pretty carefully before the test. There's quite a bit of questions on the test that come from this, and I want to make sure you have some of the specific details about it. The last part of this chapter is how governments affect migration, and we've talked, I mean, obviously, I think immigration is the biggest way that governments do this. So there are immigration laws that the governments do to restrict immigration, or to be fair, they may also invite people to come as guest workers, which encourages more immigration. A quota is a limit on the number of migrants. Oftentimes countries have quotas where they will only allow a certain number of people from, let's say, Syria. They may put a quota on refugees as well. Like they're willing to take, 10,000 refugees from Syria, but they won't take any more. That's a quota. That's a limit. And you also have countries do selective immigration where they may bar people from certain places. United States did this after 9/11. I'm going to fast forward to another slide and for just a second. So post 9/11, these countries were all put on a selective list where they were very carefully screened before they were allowed to enter the country. And you will also notice, if you talk about Trump's travel ban, that there's also other countries where they're not allowed to come into the country at all. So this is certainly, as a post 9/11, it has created more security issues, more border control and more security issues, not just in the United States, but all over. So we have more selective immigration going on, barring certain people from entering a country. You do have waves of immigration. This is the last thing I want to talk about. And this is sort of interesting for historical knowledge. So you can tell when there's been huge spikes. This is related to the Irish potato famine. This is related to the Italians moving into the United States. Again, look at the high yellow bar, that's from Europe, whereas it's not as clear over here with this higher bar. This is the total bar. You do have North America, namely Mexico, but also from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, like South America, Central America, and even Africa to a lesser extent. So knowing when these huge waves of immigration occur is important, and understanding the reasons why. So hopefully this has been helpful for you for getting ready for your test. Please let me know if you have any questions. Remember, there's also practice questions on eClass, and you're welcome to ask questions in class or stay after or before school to get some more help. Thanks so much. Bye.